I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Queen Elizabeth II ruled the United Kingdom for 7 decades. During her momentous reign, she enjoyed joyous and unforgettable moments. However, she also faced adversity and sorrow. Here are some of the occasions during her reign which demonstrate her outstanding character and incredible resolve. These are the moments that defined her.
Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne in February 1952 after the death of her father, King George VI, and her coronation took place the following year in 1953. Now, this was the first coronation to be televised worldwide. That was on the request of Queen Elizabeth II. Millions of people watched it on TV, listened to it on the radio. Lots of people bought colour TVs, especially for this occasion, to be able to see the golden state coach and the crowns and the gowns and everything on display. Prince Philip was the first husband of a monarch not to be crowned, but he did swear his allegiance to the Queen at the time, and then there was a huge procession that took its way all the way around London because she wanted as many people as possible to be able to see her on that day. It
was this extraordinary occasion. It was absolutely massive. They managed to fit more than 8,000 people into Westminster Abbey. And you compare that with King Charles's coronation, where there was just over 2,000. So they had all these kind of tiered seating, these banks of seats. It was absolutely extraordinary. It was just stuffed full of peers of the realm who had to wait there for hours and hours and couldn't go through anything. I think some of them brought in sandwiches inside their coronets. But of course, one of the things that everyone remembers is Queen Salote of Tonga, because even though it was in June, it bucketed down with rain that day. But she was so enjoying the occasion, she thought she was there to be seen. So she was going in her carriage. She had the roof off. I think the chap who was sitting, some sultan who was in the carriage with her, was quite keen to have the roof back on again, but she was having none of it. And she pretended not to understand it. And she was quite a large lady, and she completely captured the imagination of the crowd. They absolutely loved her.
I think that connecting with the public on that Jubilee tour was so important for Queen Elizabeth II because she understood that she was undertaking a life of service, and this service had to be for everybody in the United Kingdom and within the realms and within the wider Commonwealth. The best place for that to start was to start at home. And I think she wanted to really thank people for their support during the time of her ascending to the throne. Remember, she was in her early 20s. She was young. And so I think she wanted to use her youthfulness and her energy to be able to go on this tour, to say thank you to people for their support, but also to let them know that she was a queen for all and she was a queen for everyone. You know, she said in her speech the night before she ascended to the throne that she was dedicated to this life of service. And I think that was her way of starting that off and doing it on the right footing. The Diamond Jubilee in 2012, it was such a shame because it rained so much. And I remember the pictures of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II being on that boat going up and down the Thames in the pouring rain. And I must admit, I felt really quite sorry for them at this time. Millions of people watched the Diamond Jubilee concert on television as well. I remember that really well. But yeah, the thing I remember most about it was that it rained so much.
As head of the Commonwealth, the Queen played an important symbolic and unifying role. The importance of the UK's relationship with Australia was and still is paramount, and so her visits down under were incredibly significant.
The Queen was the first monarch to visit Australia in 1954, just after her coronation, and she visited numerous times over the years, her last visit being in 2011. And I think the Queen had a special affinity for Australia, and Australia did for the Queen as well. Now, over those years, it went from people being really mad about the royal family and mad about the Queen to being less so and perhaps turning towards republicanism. And so over the years, while the Queen visited, she also had less powers there. She kind of signed over more powers for things to be done by the state, less things to be controlled by her, whether it was making laws, other things like that. And I think people in Australia saw that over the years, that she still supported Australia. Australia was a hugely important part of the realms in the Commonwealth, but she understood the need for Australia to rule itself as well. And she remained hugely popular, even though there was conversations about Australia becoming a republic. A lot of people felt that those conversations would become louder and more significant after her death, which they have. But she was just such a popular figure. She knew the value of Australia in the Commonwealth and really respected the country, and just had a wonderful time when she was there.
She's head of state there. And exactly the same thing applies to Australia as it does to here. You've got to be seen to be believed. You've got to be a presence. I mean, it's no. I think Australia would have got rid of the monarchy quite a few years ago if the Queen simply never went. She had to go. And that first time she went, she was on this massive Commonwealth tour. It took 5.5 months. And when she was in Australia, I think she was seen by something like 70% of the population. It was extraordinary. She was there for quite a long time. You've got to remember that was not that long after the war. And here was this new queen, young queen. There was a sense that she was young, she represented the future, there was a sense of renewal. And of course, she was the first reigning monarch to visit Australia. So they were very excited. And of course, the other absolutely fundamental thing was they didn't really have television in those days. I mean, maybe a few people had it, but not many. So if you wanted to see her, you had to go out. So yeah, they were very keen. I remember going on that trip because the palace had hinted that it was probably going to be the last time she ever went, and it duly was that. And the occasion that really struck me was she went on this river trip down the River Brisbane on some kind of catamaran, I think. And just seeing, as we went along the river, I was on a boat behind her. As we went along the river, just seeing the crowds lining the riverbanks, it was absolutely extraordinary. I remember talking to an Australian television reporter who was quite taken aback. She said she had no idea, this one, that the crowds would be like that. It just showed that they were very keen to see her. And she had their love, she had their respect. I mean, people in the long term, Australia might feel differently about the monarchy in general, but for the Queen in particular, they really loved her and they really respected her.
Queen Elizabeth II had 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. Her relationship with her children has often been critiqued, and her relationship with her heir Charles in particular was a long source of fascination and debate.
When Charles and Anne were born, the Queen was still Princess Elizabeth. She came to the throne far sooner than she might have anticipated, and that kept her pretty busy. And when they were still very young children, she and Prince Philip had to head off on a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth. They left their 2 young children at home in the care of nannies and their grandmother, the Queen Mother. It was seen as the right thing to do, the Queen saw at the time. Rather than dragging the children all around the world with her, it was a generational thing.
Her later 2 children, Edward and Andrew, were born when she was in her 30s. So that was quite late, in the 60s for a mother to have children, but she took a lot of time off to spend with Andrew and Edward, time that she didn't get with Charles and Anne because she was busy becoming queen. She was busy having a coronation. She was busy really getting her feet under the table and understanding the job. Now, the Queen has often come under a lot of criticism for her parenting, particularly with Charles. But with Andrew and Edward, maybe she, realised that and thought it was a time to maybe make up for that.
Princess Anne was characteristically robust in countering the narrative that the Queen had been an uncaring mother. It simply beggars belief, she said. She enjoyed a close bond with her mother over their shared love of horses. She was her only daughter. They talked together about clothes, they shared advice on fashion for their public appearances, for example. And it was thought that the Queen's favourite night of the week was in fact Mabel's night off, as it was known, when Mabel, the nanny, wasn't working, and the Queen was then able to bathe her children herself and spend time with them in the nursery.
And visitors to Windsor Castle, would note how loud and boisterous Andrew and Edward were. She gave them maybe a looser leash. She gave them more time to kind of express their personality. They would get on their bikes, they would cycle around Windsor Castle. They were given far more opportunity to really be themselves that Charles and Anne didn't. And it's possible that she knew with Charles that because he had such an important job, she had to keep him grounded, she had to teach him more, and with Edward and Andrew, she could be a little bit more of a motherly figure to them rather than a teacher as she was to Charles.
The Queen undoubtedly shared a close bond with all of her children, but the relationship she had with her grandchildren was said to be even more special.
The Queen was actively part of the grandchildren's lives, particularly Prince William. When Prince William was at school at Eton, he would come once a week, he'd visit the Queen at Windsor Castle, and they'd just have a little bit of fun, they'd have a little bit of a chat, and it was that kind of private conversations between Queen and her grandson William that's really helped William in his later years, and one day when he becomes king, he will rely on that kind of close touch with his grandmother, and also with Harry. Harry has spoken very openly about his bond with his grandmother, about the shared sense of humour. He did an interview a couple of years ago with American TV, and he was talking about how much he enjoys spending time with his grandmother because they like to have fun, because that's what Harry often brings to the relationship, that kind of, boisterous ability. And the Queen obviously had a sense of humour. But there's others as well. I mean, Peter Phillips is often called her favourite grandchild. He was the first, he was the first grandchild that she had, so she was particularly proud of him.
The Queen's grandchildren said that behind palace walls, she was just another grandmother. Granny, as she was known to them, Gangan to the great-grandchildren, or Gary to the young Prince William, who couldn't pronounce Granny, much to her delight. Their times at Balmoral were the times they were really able to enjoy being with her. And I think she was able to show a softer side of herself with her grandchildren.
In a speech marking the 40th year of her reign, the late Queen stated, "1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. In a year when the marriages of 3 of her 4 children ended, there had been a fire at her beloved home, Windsor Castle, and the publication of a racy book and leaked phone conversations from Princess Diana and Prince Charles to their lovers, known as the Squidgygate tapes and Camillagate, respectively, added scandal to a year when taxpayers were questioning the cost of the royal family. The Queen's speech is now seen as a significant moment implicating public and media pressure."
So in 1992, the Queen described that year as her annus horribilis, and she gave a speech in which she used that phrase when she talked, a little bit about the things that had happened that year, 3 divorces of her children, the fire that had happened at our beloved family home. But in this speech, she also asked for empathy and basically said, no matter who you are, difficult things happen, so just give us some time to adjust to all the things that had happened. And she got a standing ovation for that speech, actually, because I think a lot of people could relate that, whether you are royalty or not, difficult things will happen to you in your life. And sometimes people just need some time to process that. I think Queen Elizabeth II made some decisions to open up Buckingham Palace after the fire and also offer to pay income tax because she realised that the tide was perhaps turning against the royal family. Remember, you had those 3 divorces. It was around the time of the War of the Wales, and I think people were kind of getting a bit fed up of the soap opera of the royal family, and so it was a way of repairing their reputation for kind of saying, okay, we're gonna stand up, we're gonna take responsibility for these things, we're not going to ask for any more money from the taxpayer to repair Buckingham Palace, we're going to try and do it ourselves. And I think it was about sort of trying to earn the public's respect and trying to turn the negative feelings that were perhaps against the royal family at that time and saying, look, we will take responsibility for this, we won't take any more money from the taxpayer. And I think she felt that was really important at that time.
We've never seen her talk in quite those terms before. The line that everyone remembers is she said something to the effect that she would not look back on 1992 with undiluted affection. And she said, in the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has been an annus horribilis, which got translated the next day in the Sun's front page at one's bum year.
I was a journalist on the Daily Express at the time, and I remember that obviously the Queen we'd had the Great Fire at Windsor, and her voice was still croaky from the smoke. And it was a distinctive voice that she said when she said about the annus horribilis. which was a shocking thing to say. And it had been a pretty bad year, let's be honest.
But there was also a more significant line in that, which really went to the heart of, because the royal family had become under a lot of criticism that year. It wasn't just the breakup of the marriages, it wasn't just the issues raised by the Windsor fire. There was also a continuing row about whether the Queen should pay income tax, which was really gaining momentum. And she said that no institution, it has to accept the scrutiny of those who support it, and indeed those who do not. So she was accepting the idea that the scrutiny of the royal family was actually a valid thing. Well, I mean, two things: the funding of the repairs to Windsor Castle, and one of the things was people were shocked to discover it wasn't actually insured. I think because it was too expensive to insure. And it was Peter Brook, the Heritage Secretary, who announced that the government would pay for it, and there was just a revolt against that. People thought that wouldn't do. And, obviously there were talks between the palace and the government, and they realised they'd have to do something about it. And they had the brilliant idea of, raising money by opening up Buckingham Palace to the people, which was a good thing. It was a way of making the monarchy more sort of accessible and relevant. But of course it took quite a few years before the royal family was out of the doldrums, because it wasn't just 1992. The coming years were equally troublesome. There was Diana's Panorama interview in 95. There was the death of Diana in 97, where the royal family was pretty unpopular, and they did evolve after that. They did try to make themselves less stuffy. They tried to make themselves more relevant. They tried to change the sorts of engagements they did. Famously, the Queen had tea with someone in a council house. They did change the way they operated, and slowly the royal family's reputation recovered, but it took time. And by the time of the Golden Jubilee in 2002, there was a lot of affection on the streets during that year. I remember that year, and they had begun to turn things down, but it wasn't easy.
I think the death of Diana is a moment that would be etched on my mind as a reporter. And I remember being on the Daily Express at the time, the headline we were saying was "Show Us You Care," which was shown, I think, in the film The Queen at the time. It was quite and then the big row about whether the Union flag should be flown over Buckingham Palace, and then the speech that she made. That was quite traumatic stuff. I mean, there was a lot of people on the streets of London then that weren't happy with the royal family, that were really appalled by the way that there had been the reaction to Diana's death, appalled that this could have ever happened.
Look, it's so hard for the royals because they have to juggle professional responsibility and personal grief at the same time. That's something Charles has experienced recently when the Queen herself died. Going back all those years, I mean, the Queen was not just dealing with her own grief for Diana, but also, most importantly, they wanted to protect William and Harry and give them space and time in which to process the fact that they'd lost their mother. I think probably the Queen, in hindsight, should have released a statement slightly earlier just to keep the public at bay, but I think everybody will have a huge amount of sympathy for the fact that perhaps it wasn't the best possible decision at an incredibly difficult time. I struggle to see how anybody could really, in the fullness of time, hold it against the Queen, given everything that they were going through. I mean, to watch Harry and William's hearts be ripped out in that way is going to have a huge emotional impact on everybody around them. I think the Queen respected Diana a huge amount, particularly in the early days, and she really believed in the marriage. I think she wanted very much for the marriage to stay together and was, upset and disappointed when it didn't. They probably had some tense moments as well. I mean, Diana actually described at one point going to the Queen to ask for help with Charles and with the marriage, and the Queen kind of saying, "Oh, I don't know what you should do. Charles is hopeless." I think the Queen had Diana come for meetings with her in tears many times. It was a situation that was clearly spiraling out of control, and I think the Queen probably felt slightly helpless in terms of what you actually do to steady that ship. But I think ultimately she did have a lot of respect for Diana, and I think she liked Diana very much. I think she was just very sad that the marriage didn't work.
Well, first and foremost, the late Queen wanted to protect her family, her two young grandchildren who were suffering in the most awful manner. Their mother killed in a tragic accident. And while the country, indeed the world, were looking to her to speak out or to deliver a tribute to Princess Diana. I think her first port of call had to be those two young boys, and certainly the pressure on her mounted not only from the people but the government. We saw Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, getting involved, and she took the right steps, I think, at the right time, and we did see that statement a few days later where she spoke about Diana quite fondly. There was lots of people calling into question the monarchy's role in a modern society. The Queen wanted to look after her grandchildren. That was her main focus in those first days and weeks after Princess Diana had passed away. But certainly there was a calling from the public for the Queen to step forward, not only to make a tribute, but to answer some of the questions as to what the monarchy was feeling. How was she feeling? What would happen to Charles and the two boys who were suffering so much? And when you look at the sort of passage of time, it really wasn't that much at all. But in the sort of throes of the actual moment, it did seem like she took an age to make that statement.
Following the messy end to both Charles and Camilla's previous relationships, the Queen was left in a difficult position, especially as the head of the Church of England. For Charles and Camilla's relationship to move forward and gain the public's blessing, it would undoubtedly need the approval of Queen Elizabeth first.
Well, it was a tricky situation for the late Queen as head of the Church of England. She didn't really want to be seen to be underscoring Charles and Camilla's relationship that had operated in the shadows for so many years. And of course, the public fallout that she had to deal with as well. It wasn't just trying to appease her family. She had to appease the public and what the reaction would be to a union of Charles and Camilla, what that would mean of Charles and Camilla as king and queen. And now we obviously know what has happened throughout history, but it was a very testing time for the late Queen for sure. It was an incredibly difficult situation for Camilla. Of course, she absolutely loved and adored Charles and wanted to be with him, of course, throughout those years. But in terms of coming into the institution, in terms of coming into a new life for her, into the role of a princess consort, later queen consort, she didn't really know what the future held. But when you look at what has happened to her life within the royal family, she pretty much got on with the job. She kept her head down, with very much public enemy number one at some stage. And you look at where she's come to now, it's been a remarkable transformation. Well, Charles and his late mother had quite a frosty relationship at times, I think it's fair to say, but there was a deep bond, of course. The Queen felt obviously responsible for him as a mother, but hugely responsible to what sort of king he would become. And certainly in the years that his relationship was faltering with Princess Diana, leading on to their eventual divorce, it was a testing time not only for Charles and the Queen, but for the rest of the monarchy. What would the monarchy look like in the future? And certainly in Charles's hands when the Queen was no longer here. But I think she prepared him in the best way she could. Charles was a difficult character at times. He was very shy. But in terms of you seeing what legacy he will present, I think the Queen would have done a pretty good job.
The Queen is obviously a very traditional person. Tradition is hugely important to her. One of her traditions is that she only attends church weddings. She doesn't go to civil ceremonies. And Charles and Camilla were denied the opportunity to have a church wedding, owing to the fact that Camilla had a living former spouse. So they had their legals at Windsor Guildhall, which the Queen couldn't go to because, it wasn't a church wedding. And then they had this blessing at St. George's Chapel afterwards. So the Queen did attend that, and she made every effort to kind of attend it with bells and whistles, and she gave a speech in their honour. She probably felt like she was in between a rock and a hard place, because she does do things the traditional way, and she didn't want to completely rip up that tradition in order to show support for Charles and Camilla's marriage. But she found her own way of doing it that she could feel comfortable with. If we're going to be completely honest about it, things were at points very difficult between the Queen and Camilla, but it was another situation where time heals all wounds. And I think as time went on, the Queen got to see that Camilla was having a really positive effect on Charles. And of course, Charles, he did, I think realistically, he needed to remarry, and Camilla was the woman he loved. In an ideal world, Camilla would probably simply have been the woman that Charles married to begin with, and then a lot of hearts would not have been broken in all kinds of ways. I think the Queen ultimately, in time, did see that the relationship between Charles and Camilla was probably them both ending where they should have begun. And in time, the Queen obviously said that she would give her support to Camilla being known as Queen Consort, but that took so many years. I mean, it was only in 2022, the year that the Queen died, that she actually gave her blessing to that title.
The start of 2002 was a difficult period for Queen Elizabeth II, with February seeing her sister, Princess Margaret, pass away aged 71. Shortly after the upsetting death of her sister, Queen Elizabeth's mother, the Queen Mother, died in March 2002.
So the Queen was massively affected by losing her mother and her sister in a very short period of time. They were two of her key sounding boards, particularly her mother. Now, her mother became Queen Mother, a dowager widow in her 50s, so she was still a young woman. She had another 50 years next to her daughter, and she was somebody that the Queen could talk to, because she had obviously done the job. You know, she had been there on the throne with the king. Margaret's an interesting one, because Margaret was the spare. So when it emerged as that their father had become king, Margaret turned to her sister and said, I suppose you'll become queen one day. And Margaret had to deal with that her whole life, knowing that her elder sister was getting the top job. And I think that helped the Queen in later years when she was dealing with Harry and William, for instance, and her children. But it came at a time of the Queen's life in her 80s when they both died. And I think it really changed her outlook on life. The late Queen's address when her mother died was particularly poignant, and I think the most important aspect of that is when she pointed out that she had a zest for life. And that's how the public remember the Queen Mother, but it's also very interesting that she chose to draw on that particular attribute. But look, they were close friends, okay? They spoke privately. The Queen Mother helped her daughter, you know, through many years, and I imagine it might have been quite lonely for her to lose both her sister and her mother in such a short period of time. The losses of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret really meant that Prince Charles had to step up, and this was the time where he was sorting his own private life out. He was sorting his own affairs out. He'd divorced Princess Diana. He was then in a relationship with Camilla, and it really kind of a passing of the baton down to Charles and then William, that they had to step up and really show their worth, because obviously the late Queen and Prince Philip were also getting very old at that point, and they just lost people that were incredibly close to them.
When Princess Margaret died, it was devastating for the Queen. She was incredibly close to her sister, and indeed Princess Margaret's funeral is one of the rare occasions where we saw the Queen let her emotions show, her private grief being revealed as she openly cried during the service. Just a matter of weeks later, she then lost her mother. The three of them had been incredibly close. There were very few people with whom she was able to really be herself. She certainly was that with her mother and sister. They were extremely close, and that loss was profound. Immediately after Princess Margaret's death, it was actually Prince Charles who delivered the address to the nation, reflecting on the loss of his darling aunt. It wasn't until Christmas of 2002 when the Queen spoke out in her Christmas message, and she reflected on her grief and that so many would understand just what it was like to lose a mother and sister to whom she had been so close. 2002 was a year of tremendous sadness, but it was also a year of celebration. It was the Queen's Golden Jubilee. She wasn't sure quite how it would play out after those two funerals and how the public would respond. And I think her loss was shown in the most poignant fashion when she stepped out onto the balcony during the Jubilee weekend without her mother and sister for the very first time.
Of course, losing her sister at the beginning of what was the Golden Jubilee year was devastating. And then, of course, losing her mother not long afterwards was just terrible. But, I mean, what happened was the Queen then rose to the occasion come the summer when the celebrations and commemorations for her Jubilee happened. In fact, in many ways, the passing of the royal matriarch of the Queen Mother enabled the whole country to really celebrate, first and foremost, Her Majesty for the first time. Whereas before, it was always looking back to the Queen Mother. Every year we had another birthday, and it was looking back to nostalgia. But this time, without the triumvirate, the Queen, Princess Margaret, and the Queen Mother, you know, it was really focused on the Queen. And I think people saw how fortunate we were to have her.
He was her rock, her sounding board. It wasn't always a smooth ride, you know, because Prince Philip had to learn how to be the number two in a way. And from the moment the Queen ascended to the throne in the early 50s, he was then always having to be 2 or 3 steps behind. And for a man with his sort of military background and his probably a fairly macho world that he was in within the Navy, it was hard for him to deal with. But I think as years went on, they understood each other and what the role intended, and he was there as a complete sounding board to make it easier for her. And he was a no-nonsense individual, as we know, didn't suffer fools gladly, but what he was, most importantly, he understood what his role was within the royal family, and that was to support his wife, but more significantly, the Queen.
The Duke of Edinburgh's passing was, I mean, hugely impactful to the Queen. She obviously had a very tender relationship with him. He was her husband and was by her side for so many years. But I think it actually was a huge signifier of the passage of time and the changes that were taking place all around her in the midst of COVID, as the world is going through a really dark time. I think this really held a mirror up to the Queen to realize how much had changed and what the future was likely to hold. And I think Prince Philip's funeral was smaller, it was intimate, it was in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. But I think that was really true to Prince Philip and what he would have wanted. If he could have only had 30 people at his funeral, I think he would have preferred it. But that incredibly memorable Land Rover that carried his casket to the service was something that touched a lot of people. I think when we think back to the Queen and Prince Philip's relationship, a lot of people remember stories about flying tennis shoes and tennis rackets and their very spirited relationship in the early days. But I think that memorable quote the Queen had of Prince Philip being her strength and stay all these years is really what people remember the fondest, because seeing a relationship last so long and work under such a harsh microscope is really inspiring to people. To lose a partner is devastating for anyone, but to lose someone who stood by your side during a historical reign for 70 years would have had an incredibly profound impact on the Queen.
Former First Lady Michelle Obama says she was not aware of royal protocol when she placed her arm around the Queen in 2009. The moment made headlines around the world, but in her memoir, Becoming, Michelle wrote, "I did what's instinctive to me any time I feel connected to a new person." She explained, herself and the late Queen had just agreed a long day wearing heels had left them with sore feet. She wrote, "We were just 2 tired ladies oppressed by our shoes."
Michelle Obama shared in her memoir, Becoming, that this incident came about when the late Queen and Michelle Obama were sharing grievances over their uncomfortable shoes. And in a room surrounded by men in suits and practical shoes, there were 2 women in uncomfortable black shoes, wondering why they were all standing around when they'd much rather be sitting. And I think it was a moment of sisterhood, really, in a strange way, where the Queen is the leader of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, and Michelle Obama is the representative of America, where they shared a very tender moment. And Michelle Obama says it was instinct. It was girlhood. It was womanhood. It was, to put your arm around someone in camaraderie. And then the Queen decided to sort of return the favor and return the gesture and gave us, a small hug back. This story first was filled with, sort of negative coverage and shock and horror of how Michelle Obama could breach protocol in such a way. But actually, as the story evolved and we saw that the Queen returned the gesture, it turned into a very tender moment between 2 women in such incredible public positions.
Something of nothing, really. It just seemed to be completely in character with Michelle Obama, because she would think the sort of thing she would naturally do. Presumably had met the Queen before, so was just greeting as old friends. And I suppose you can get away with it when you are the First Lady of America. But the Queen didn't seem to be put out by it. Subsequently, of course, we saw Donald Trump at a state visit, and then you think, well, he's charging in front of the Queen. And I think even she thought she said, oh, it's just Donald. I think that's probably what she thought, and just let him get away with it. As he was inspecting the troops, because he thought it was all about him. Michelle Obama hugging the Queen just looking over the pictures again, you just think, well, that was all right. Nothing offensive. I don't think the Queen felt as if that the worst thing that happened to her in her reign was being hugged by Michelle Obama. Throughout her reign, she was able to adapt to the situation. Because if you imagine every occasion she's out and about, everybody sort of probably doesn't really know how to behave in front of her. So it's her job to put people at ease. And we've seen that through her reign. She was very good at that, whether it would be a sort of cheeky smile or just knowing what to say in whatever circumstance. So for me, the Queen, with all that experience right to the very end, knew how to deal with whoever she was meeting, because she knew how to deal with even if it was a complicated situation that had gone wrong, she would know how to sort of take the air out of the situation and diffuse whatever was going on.